Hey, how's it going, guys? I just finished my Korean Deathmatch Civilization overview, and I think that for a while I'm going to take a break on Civilization and unit overviews, and instead I'm going to talk about Deathmatch strategy. And I think that the natural place to start this would be the early game in a Deathmatch game. For beginners, this is probably the hardest part to learn because it's so much different from a random match game, but in this video I'm going to tell you some of the basics, and I hope that this is going to improve your game. So briefly, Deathmatch is a game mode in which you start with a lot of resources, and most people who play it start it already in the Imperial Age, so it basically bypasses all the Dark Age, Feudal Age, Castle Age stuff. However, you still start with the same amount of buildings and villagers, and this means that Deathmatch is a very distinct early game that's very important to learn in order to succeed well in Deathmatch. Now, many new players, when they start up a deathmatch game, have no idea what they're supposed to do because they're overwhelmed by the post-imperial start age and by the extra resources. But I think that if you keep in mind that what you're trying to do is eliminate your opponent, this is going to guide you in the way you need to go. What this means is you need to create military production at the start of a game. Because remember, you don't need to get an economy up quite yet because you already have a bunch of resources. And you need to attack that enemy to cripple his early game, or defend against an enemy's rush. Either way, you still need to have military presence. What this means in general is that you need to create military buildings, you need to create houses, and you need to create villagers in order to build these things for you. So this is basically what the early game of a deathmatch game is. However, there are some techniques that have been learned by many players, including myself, that really speed this up and make it as efficient as possible. And I'm going to try to tell these to you. Now, please don't think of this as a build order, because build orders often have very, very specific time constraints, and I just don't like the whole idea of me telling you what to do. However, for the first 15 seconds of the game, there's really no better way to do it than this. So the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to queue up 15 villagers. And if you know hotkeys, I would suggest that you use hotkeys for those. However, it's not absolutely necessary at the very beginning levels of deathmatch games. The next thing you're going to want to do is send your scout to either the enemy's base or to where you think the enemy's going to rush. This depends on if you want to play defensively or if you want to play offensively at the start of a game. This is your choice, and I suggest that for a new player, actually just kind of keep that scout near your own base to defend against your enemy's scout. The next thing you want to do is with your first villager, create a house right where he is. With the second villager, create a military building. And for most civilizations, this military building is going to be a barracks. And we'll just use the barracks for the rest of this example. So you'll create a barracks. With the next villager, you'll do the same thing. By now, your fourth villager should be almost finished creating, and once he does so, use that villager to create another military building. So you start with basically 3 military buildings and a house. By now, your enemy's hussar should be coming near your base, and you're going to need to defend against that. So what you do is you attack that with your own hussar if you've kept it here, or you keep your villagers kind of moving around and garrison them in a town center, etc., etc. And what you want to do with this is to keep those villagers from dying. However, you still want to keep them actually active. You want to keep them building buildings, because if you don't, it's just as well that that villager would be dead. You don't want idle villagers. So once your first barracks is built, immediately create some units. Now, if your enemy is going to be rushing you with horses, create spearmen. If he's going to be rushing you with huskarls or eagle warriors, create champions. But you always want to be creating as soon as you possibly can. Once you have this started, you want to keep having those villagers creating houses and military buildings, because you need to keep your military production up, and you need to keep it up as fast as you can. Also, when you're building those extra military buildings, build them in such a way so that they are placed in front of your town center, and so that way there are no gaps between them if you are playing defensively. What this does is it protects your town center and your villagers from your enemy's incoming units, and this keeps them alive, which therefore allows them to actually be building. You're going to want to set the gather points of those military buildings outside of this circle you're creating around your town center, because that's where the enemies are going to be. This is basically how you do a defensive deathmatch start. This is probably the first minute of the game. I'm going to talk about the early game after this a little bit later, but first I want to go over how you do an offensive start, or a rush start. What you're going to want to do with a rush start is build probably stables if you have good mounted units, or barracks if you have really fast foot units, such as Huskarls or Eagle Warriors. You're also probably going to want to send that Hussar to your enemy's base instead of keeping it at your own base, because you need to slow down your enemy's defenses. Now, if you're not very confident with this, you can still keep your Hussar at home to defeat your enemy's Hussar. However, it's probably better if you can learn to attack the enemy's base. What you want to do is you want to set the gather points of your military buildings to be near the enemy's base, and you want to send out units as quickly as you can. Also, one thing I would suggest is that you double-click on your military buildings, press and hold Control, and then tap one of the numbers. What this does is it puts those buildings in a control group, and once you release Control, if you tap one again, it'll immediately select those buildings, which means that it'll select those buildings without you having to manually go over and click on them. And what this means is that while you're looking at your enemy's base, you can queue up more units. Also, if you double-click that one, for instance, you're actually going to shift your view to where those are. So it's actually faster than using your mouse to scroll over there or to click on the minimap. What this does is it just speeds up your game just by a little bit. And I think that speed is what is really important in the beginning of a deathmatch game. Once your units start to actually get to your enemy's base, you want to use those units to attack villagers. I would suggest attack villagers that are making houses if you can, because those units are creating houses which allow your opponent to create military units, which are more threatening. Once you take off a few of his enemy villagers, if you manage to do this, you're then going to want to kind of focus on all future villagers and your enemy's town center, if you have a good rush civ. And the reason you want to do this is because you need to follow through with your rush to put pressure on. However, if you feel like that you have overextended yourself and he's defending his rush well, continue sending units to his base, but don't try to lose those units while attacking the town center or villagers. Instead, use those units to keep his units occupied and to keep him from expanding. And what this does is it allows you to actually gain map control. And these are basically the two forms of deathmatch start. You have a defensive start, and you have an offensive start. Now, it sounds like an offensive start is a lot better, and it is. However, you need to keep in mind that this is really determined by your civilization, because a civilization that doesn't have any good offensive rush units, it doesn't have fast units, it's not going to be a good offensive rush civilization for the early game. The best deathmatch rushing civilization would obviously be the Huns, because they don't have to build houses, and because their paladins are created really fast. The second best, I would say, would be the Goths, because they create infantry units incredibly fast, and because they create one of the best raiding units in the game, the Elite Huskarl, at the barracks at a reduced speed. And you can just spam your opponent's base with these units incredibly fast in a deathmatch game. This is probably why the Goths are one of my favorite civilizations to play in deathmatch. Third best, I would probably have to say, would be Aztecs or Franks, or any civilization that has a strong unit creation bonus. Mesoamerican civilizations are also pretty good in general and might even fall into this category because those units, which would be the elite, Eagle Warrior is a good raiding unit. Fourth, I would probably have to put any civilizations rather, that have access to either the heavy camel or the paladin, because these are just strong, fast units. Fifth, I would have to say all the other civilizations, except for civilizations whose really strong units are created at the Siege Workshop or just slowly in general. And this would be the sixth category. And what comes to mind for me personally would be the Koreans, but I'm sure there are other civilizations who are just really slow like this. The next stage of a deathmatch early game would be during the mid or final stages of that initial rush. And what you need to do during this is you need to build your economies by placing a town center first near gold, and then secondly near another resource that is determined by your civilization. And then also you need to start gaining map control. And this doesn't matter if you're on the receiving end of that rush or on the giving end of that rush. You still need to do this. And the reason you want to do these two things is because those initial resources that sound like a whole lot, they're going away. They're going to be gone before too long. And you need to keep up that pressure if you're giving a rush, and you need to continue to defend if you're on the receiving end of a rush. And in general, if you are able to do this, you'll actually repel your enemy's rush if they haven't been super effective. The last stage of the early game would be after that initial rush has finished. What you need to do during this stage is you need to continue to expand your economies, and you need to continue to grow your military. And the reason you want to do this is because you're transitioning into the mid-game. And what this does for you is it allows you to continue to keep up pressure on your opponent without overextending yourself if you're rushing or falling behind if you're defending. And what this will do, if you do it properly, is it'll set you up for the mid-game and for success. Now here are a few tips for once you've reached this part of the game. The first one is that even though town centers can be very useful, don't make too many of them, because that's a waste of stone and of villager build time. Instead, take some villagers off of a resource and use a previously built town center to create more villagers, because that town center should have stopped creating villagers by now. Another tip is that while you still need to keep pressure up on your opponent, don't do it by just giving a steady trickle of units into his base, because this is going to be easy for him to deal with at this point. Instead, I would suggest that you make powerful unit combinations of units that complement each other and cover each other's weaknesses. So for example, if I'm Goths, I'm going to start making some trebuchets to take out his buildings, but I'll also be making units such as hand cannoneers or onagers to keep the opponent from using units that are good against my Huskarls. If I'm the Koreans, I'm going to have war wagons, I'm going to have halberdiers, I'm going to have onagers, and probably maybe some other siege weapons. So you just need to have a good unit composition of healthy units that are going to do a good job at keeping each other alive. Because at this point, a war of attrition is not what's going to allow you to win the game. Instead, it is, or at least should be, a war of effective and powerful attacks in which you don't lose as much as your opponent, and in which you gain ground and continue to gain map control. So this is basically everything I have to say about the early game in a deathmatch game. And this is so important because it sets you up for either success or failure in the future of the game. While it is true that from time to time you can come back from mistakes you've made in the early game, or your opponent will make mistakes in the mid game, but more often than not, it has been my experience that if you give your opponent a strong advantage in the early game, you're going to lose. And if he gives you a strong advantage, and if you don't overextend yourself and use that advantage wisely, you're going to win. I hope that this video has cleared up some questions that newer players might have about Deathmatch, and maybe what I'm saying isn't correct. If not, please correct me. Tell me what you think about my advice. I've also put some other resources in the description of this video, and who knows, maybe you'll find those helpful. See you later, and thanks for watching.